So not exactly the best Warhammer news today. Games Workshop have announced their yearly price increases, and already expensive Warhammer is getting even pricier. Let's talk about the changes, how they stack up versus inflation, and some thoughts overall on Games Workshop pricing. Hello and welcome back to Warspec Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's unfortunate news that they're increasing prices once again. Unfortunate, but maybe not so unexpected. It does usually seem that they adjust prices between spring and summer most years, and this one is this year's one. Obviously, this is pretty bad news whenever it does turn up. Warhammer's well known for being pretty expensive for the amount of plastic miniatures that you get versus other options, and certainly for some people around the world, say in Australia and New Zealand, they're paying quite a big markup anyway. Never the best news when those prices go further higher. For price rises, this seems like it's coming a little bit later than last year's one. I made a video last time round, and last time it went up on the 6th of March 2023. The average price rise around about being 6% or so, according to Games Workshop at that point. And from as best I could tell, going through the actual list of prices in a follow-up video to that, it did seem to be broadly in line with what they said. Obviously some things went up a bit more, some things a bit less, but the average was fairly consistent with what they publicised. It looks like this year's price increases are coming a little bit later, 10th of June this time round, and they have given us a month's warning on this, which admittedly they didn't really have to. So the heads up isn't the worst in the world, even if it's never really going to be popular with your customers if you're raising prices on things that already feel like they're costed at a premium. As per normal, they're blaming inflation for this. It has been really quite high lately, particularly in the UK since their last price rise. We'll get onto that in just a second. On the one hand, just on the face of it, it does look like it's a below inflation price rise if their numbers are to be believed, but on the other hand, it's still all a bit arbitrary. As I might cycle back to, Warhammer items tend to be priced at just the amount that people will be prepared to pay, kind of divorced from any sort of cost of materials or anything like that, though maybe a bit more just in general how much the overall product launch makes sense to Games Workshop, and you could easily argue that Games Workshop do have a lot of scope for reducing prices out there. They have been doing very well in terms of profits over the last few years. While this price rise no doubt makes sense to them for an overall profit point of view, they certainly do have room to reduce things if they really wanted to, and they wanted to try and help out their customers a bit. This time round, the average price increases are reportedly around about 3 to 5%. Basically, a whole load of kits will go up to sort of the next bracket worth of pricing, and this will depend heavily on country, currency, and region. Any one kit in one country might go up more or less than their advertised amount. As with last time when they said their rough ballpark 6% type thing, some things went up far in excess of that, some things went up far below or stayed entirely the same. It is going to vary kit to kit and model to model depending on your location and what currency you're paying in. The only other clue to that regard is that they're going to have an oversized price increase in Sweden and Norway, so bad luck if you're living over there, I guess. I guess the reason for that would be that typically Warhammer's perhaps been maybe a slightly better deal than plenty of places around in the rest of the world, maybe perhaps surprisingly so given that they tend to be quite rich countries, high cost of living and high taxes and all that. My guess is they might be putting up prices there more than most, as they feel that there might be enough scope to increase prices there without having too much effect on people stopping buying outright, all just speculation on my part there though. In the example of the price increases, they gave us Necron Warriors as an example. Necron Warriors have increased from $48 to $50 on the 10th of June apparently, and for other currencies it'll be £30 to £31.50 in the UK, or €40 to €41 in the EU. That looks like it's a spread of 2.5% to 5% in rises there, depending on region. I guess if they are being accurate with their estimations, then other things will likely go up around about the same sort of amount. Sounds like it's broadly going to be the vast majority of their products that are doing that. Apparently the things that will be exempt from these price rises will be the White Dwarf magazines, any paint pots and paint sets, and any Black Library books and digital offerings. Everything else will be going up a bit. As mentioned, the reason that they give for these price increases is, as ever, inflation. I think anyone who's been following that to any extent will be knowing that inflation has been really quite high for quite a bit of the past year or so. Here in the UK, here's just one graph that shows the UK CPI rate since January 2023 to now. Since March when Games Workshop passed increased prices, it was initially around about 8 to 9%, then dropped down to 7% for a bit, and then has been trundling along about 4% for a bit, before dropping a bit more closer to 3. Just taking an average over the whole year for that, it looks like it would be around about perhaps a 6% sort of rate since Games Workshop's past price increase, plus the fact that you'd have to account for the fact that it's actually been a bit over a year since Games Workshop last increased prices, more like a year and 3 months. So I guess overall, if they were just doing things in line for inflation, you might have maybe more expected things to go up by perhaps 6 to 7% perhaps, as opposed to 3 to 5. At least going by UK inflation data, it looks like from Games Workshop's point of view this might well be a below inflation price increase, at least on the UK market. At least over this period, it doesn't look to me like they're trying to increase things beyond the scope of inflation. Obviously, that is presuming that that 3 to 5% figure is honest. Obviously, this doesn't mean that it's good news for consumers or anything like that necessarily. Some wages around the world will have kept pace with inflation, many have not though. If everything around the world is going up in price by, say, the 6% or so since last time, and your wages and income haven't gained by that amount or more in that time, then it still means that it's a worse deal overall for you individually. So it's still not like you can say that this is necessarily good news for people even within the UK. Around the world, it's potentially worse as well, given that perhaps the UK's inflation rate has been higher than most. If you look at the USA, their figures are more like 6% down to 3% over that same sort of period. And it doesn't look like it's going to be necessarily a below inflation rate increase for you guys over there, though maybe it doesn't look notably above it either. As mentioned earlier, and I've talked about in previous videos, Games Workshop pricing really is quite nebulous and broadly just determined by what they feel like charging people. They are a company with shareholders and all that entails, so they will set prices at a level to try and maximise profits for themselves, which obviously isn't always great news for the consumer. They just basically set their prices on Warhammer kits to try and charge as much as possible before you get so much to tip the balance in people just not being interested in the overall proposition whatsoever. They generally don't want to price their entire customer base out of the market, but they also don't want to set things so low that they're leaving money on the table. Games Workshop's prices can afford to operate somewhat similarly to something like a monopoly, given that they've got such a dominance over tabletop war games, and particularly lots of people who are highly invested in Warhammer 40k as a setting and the plastic miniatures in themselves, basically meaning that there'll be some people that are largely prepared to pay almost no matter how high they put prices. People who maybe have a lot of disposable income or don't buy models at a particularly high rate to the extent where the price of Warhammer isn't the biggest factor to them. Obviously, they're not really in a monopoly, they do have competition from other wargame systems, lookalike sculpts, 3D printed miniatures, and other wargame systems that could easily take over if they really do price people away. Though it doesn't really seem like these have in any way harmed their dominance over the recent years. Prices just aren't really related directly to their cost to produce any one item. After they've decided that a sculpt is worth investing in the money to design it and make molds for it, they're kind of printing money from that point. I guess that Games Workshop's main expenses more come from logistics more than anything else, maintaining really quite a big warehouse with a ridiculous amount of stock, which is kind of clear they have trouble with. And you can tell that prices aren't really related to the amount of plastic in the box in a major way, as there are some kits that have, say, 2 or 3 times the same amount of plastic in them, but are sold at the same cost as that's what they think people will pay for that miniature. They still make profits on really viable, vast discount things like, say, the Imperium magazine or the Leviathan box set in the past. It generally makes sense for them to have some things that are sold at discount rates for them, and then more things that are sold at higher prices, almost like the upsell on given collectors after that. Basically, they are doing very well and have massive profits at the moment. It does mean that if they wanted and they thought the numbers added up, they wouldn't necessarily have to do an increase by exactly this much or exactly now. It's basically their calculation for what would make them the most money, balanced between charging people as much as they're prepared to pay, but also not alienating people en masse and tanking their overall system. Overall, for this individual price increase, I feel like it's not the best news, though maybe could have been worse. I feel like at least giving people a month's heads up isn't the worst news in the world, as they could basically just have announced price increases that are going up this weekend and everyone just has to deal with it, potentially annoying people's plans if they were thinking about picking up some exact things in the future. Probably the best use as individual hobbyists, if you were thinking about picking something up, is basically just make sure you don't do a really big order from Games Workshop or a discount retailer just after June the 10th. That just seems like the stupidest move that you could make. If you are absolutely sure that you're picking up something from Games Workshop or a discount retailer before then, just make sure you do it at the current prices and not paying the extra 3 to 5% or whatever it happens to be. Or just decide that you're not buying it in general and dismiss it from considerations. As always, if prices increase and then potentially some other things stay similar, it's going to place more emphasis on alternative sources to Games Workshop, perhaps might drive a few more people to look into 3D printing, second-hand markets, or alternative third-party miniatures out there. And of course, price increases will likely mean at least some people decide to either leave the hobby or not join the hobby in the first place. It is always a bit sad when Games Workshop sets the prices so high that potentially interested people in Warhammer just don't get in because they can't afford it with all the other expensive things in life going on. As with last time, we'll have to see how much things actually go up by. I'll hopefully do a follow-up video on that sometime later when we do get some news on that. As mentioned, looks like some things will be unequal per region. Will be interesting to see if they were accurate with their estimations this time round. In any case though, not the greatest news. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I'm sure this will go down absolutely terribly, as it usually does when Games Workshop raises prices on already pretty expensive plastic soldiers. If you like catching the news and updates, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. Hopefully there'll be more positive things in the future. I do tend to post 40k stuff just about most days. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.